Now let's turn to talk some about policy responses to monopoly. After all, we know that historically, at least in the United States, we tend not to like monopolies very well. But at the same time, if we're going to talk about regulation, we need to think about why are we bothering to regulate these things. We shouldn't regulate something just because we don't like it. We need to have some good economic foundation if we're going to try to regulate something. So that's the first question we're going to face. Why do we regulate monopolies? And I'll lay out the basic argument. The idea is that monopolies will tend to underproduce. Right? That is, there are units that should be worth producing in terms of their value to the consumer, that the monopolies just don't find it worthwhile themselves to produce. Now, the way we define this, we'd say a unit is worth producing if its value to the consumer is greater than the marginal cost of its production. Remembering, marginal cost is how much additional cost is taken on by producing a single unit of that good. If the value to the consumer, as measured by the demand curve, is above the marginal cost of production, then it is on the whole value creating for us to go ahead and produce that. But as we'll show in a moment, there are some units that are worth producing that monopolies will not. And here I think this graph lays that out pretty well. I'm sure you remember, price and quantity for the monopoly come from where marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect. Rise there up to the top, where we across the demand curve, that quantity up to the demand curve gives us the price. So that tells us how much the monopoly will tend to produce. But now the social optimum happens at a different point, right? And that's here, where the marginal cost crosses the demand curve. Any point to the left of that, marginal cost is less than the value to the consumer reflected in the demand curve. So every single one of those units is worth producing. That's why we would call this point the social optimum. So now we're going to face a fundamental regulatory problem. Because once we've identified the social optimum, in theory regulation should in fact be extremely easy. After all, we find the social optimum, then we tell the monopoly they have to produce that much. It's that simple. And then it's just a matter of coming up with a large enough penalty if they do anything else to convince them to actually follow through on the plan we've given them. Now, in reality, regulation is actually very, very difficult, because it ends up that life is not as easy as it looks in a PowerPoint presentation. Right? Find the social optimum. Well, how exactly are we going to do that? Now, we know the social optimum exists where the demand curve crosses the marginal cost curve. But demand is not observable except at a single point at a time. All we can observe is what the quantity is that's being produced right now and the price that is being charged right now. That's all that we can observe. How much is being produced and sold, and what's the price being charged. That doesn't tell us anything really about the rest of the demand curve. One point on the demand curve does not tell us enough to find where the social optimum is unless we believe we're already at the social optimum. Also, we have the problem that demand will change over time. So even if we do manage somehow to develop an entire demand curve, give it a few days and it's going to move on us. At the same time, marginal cost is best observed by the person being regulated, or in this case by the monopoly being regulated. They have more information about their cost than we as the regulators do. So on the one hand, the one curve we need to use to find social optimum we can't observe. The other curve we need to find social optimum is best observed by the people we're trying to regulate, and they in fact have every reason to lie about what their marginal cost looks like. After all, if they can exaggerate their marginal cost, they can get us to order them to produce relatively little, which is what they want to do anyway. So in reality, there's this very serious problem in that we don't actually know where the social optimum is precisely. That makes it impossible for us to say, oh, here's the social optimum, just produce that. Really, if you break it down, the fundamental problem here is information. Right? We don't have the information we need to write this perfect regulation. Now we have an additional problem when it comes to regulating things, and that is various theories about how regulation actually works in the real world. That there are basically two views, and then those that exist between them. One view we call social interest theory. Social interest theory claims that regulators are, in fact, honestly trying to serve the social interest. They're trying to do the best thing for society as a whole. So if regulators don't do that, it's just because they're limited either in their power and the information they have. After all, regulators are still human. Humans, we know, do make mistakes, even if they're perfectly well-intentioned. But then there's another view that's somewhat more cynical. It's called regulatory capture. Regulatory capture suggests that regulators actually end up serving the regulated. Perhaps this happens because of the lobbying process. If I'm a monopoly being regulated, you can bet that I want to have a big influence over what those regulations look like. So I'm going to do things like contributing a lot of money to politicians' campaigns if they in some way are connected with regulation. I'm going to do things like providing strategic information to the regulators so that they write regulations in just the right way to tell me to do things that will be beneficial to me. Right, so we have these two views. One is social interest theory, suggesting the regulators are in fact trying to do the right thing, and they're only limited in their ability to do that. The other suggests that regulators, in the end, aren't even trying to do the right thing as far as society is concerned. Instead, they're serving the interests that they are supposed to be regulating. Right, so we have one problem is that regulation is fundamentally difficult just because we don't have information. The other problem is that maybe our regulators aren't even trying to serve the social interest at all. But either way, let's talk about some various options that are available for trying to fight the monopoly problem of underproduction. Now, the most head-on is probably antitrust policy. Antitrust policy suggests that, well, we know the problem is we have this monopoly, and monopolies will tend to underproduce. So what we're going to do is do trust busting. We're going to break this monopoly up into a bunch of little competitors. The problem that arises, though, is that once we break this monopoly up into a bunch of little competitors, we tend to see a couple problems arise. One would be, we remember there are cases where the government is explicitly and intentionally creating monopolies. This happens, for example, with patents and with copyrights. So here, stepping in and saying, wait a minute, you're the only one producing this particular book, that makes you a monopoly, let's break you up into a bunch of little pieces that will all be producing the same book. That is an obvious conflict, right? It's actually, to some degree, a rather cruel thing for governments to do, to offer you this grant of monopoly and then to punish you for taking that grant of monopoly. So as a result, what we end up doing with patents, copyrights, and licenses is that we make exceptions to the rule. So we say, okay, you're not allowed to be a monopoly, well, unless, of course, you have a copyright or a patent. In that case, then yes, you're allowed to be a monopoly for some period of time. But all that's really doing is weakening our policy against monopoly. We're just creating a bunch of exceptions where the problem is going to continue to persist. Then there's the case of the natural monopoly, that is, where large-scale production is more cost-effective than small-scale production. Well, in that case, what we would expect to see is that we'd have mergers that undo the trust bust. Right? So if we know that larger scale production is more efficient, then there's every reason for these little companies that we get after the monopoly has been broken up, they want to start getting together and merging together into larger and larger companies. This is actually what we saw with AT&T. Back in the day, AT&T was a regulated monopoly over phone service. It was decided that we needed more competition in this market. Rather than regulating AT&T directly, we wanted to break them up into a bunch of little pieces and then let these pieces try to compete. So what ended up happening was we saw these little baby bells, they were called, start merging together. Right? And sure enough, it ends up that over time, this process totally undid itself, till finally SBC, Southern Bell Corporation, was one of these baby bells, merged with AT&T, at which point, as far as I can tell, virtually every single baby bell was back under AT&T. So here we have the problem where if it is in fact more cost efficient to be bigger, then we'd expect mergers to happen that would undo the trust bust. Now, on the other hand, we could step in and say, well, you're not allowed to merge. But then that means that we end up with unnecessarily high cost. The point of a natural monopoly is that a bigger amount of production is actually more cost efficient. So if we prevent mergers from happening, we end up with higher costs than are necessary. Let's turn to another option. So rather than attacking the problem head-on and busting up monopolies to try to solve the monopoly problem, maybe we can keep the monopolies intact but regulate them to where they start actually making better decisions. The first idea here is what we call marginal cost pricing. Now let's suppose for the moment that there are no information problems. Now that's naturally a huge assumption, but let's just say that that's the case. Right, so the monopoly is allowed then to choose any quantity. They can choose whatever quantity they like, it's up to them, but they have to set their price equal to marginal cost of that quantity. Now, an interesting thing here is that it only requires us as the regulators to know what their marginal costs are to check to make sure they're charging the right price. Now, a nice thing about this is that with this type of regulation, where price is set equal to the marginal cost, there's a natural tendency for the monopoly to move toward the social optimum. Because, now normally we know monopolies will charge above the marginal cost. The demand curve lies above the marginal cost, so we'll end up with this gap wherever monopolies will generally tend to choose. But once you tell them they have to just charge whatever their marginal cost is, they don't have a reason to restrict production anymore. Restricting production keeps marginal cost down, which would push down the price they can charge. So they want to move to the point where demand crosses marginal cost, so the price that they're charging, their marginal cost, is right where marginal cost hits the demand curve. But that's the social optimum. But even this is not without problems, in that it might possibly kill the monopoly. Because the problem here is that marginal cost is not necessarily connected with your ability to make a profit overall, right? So it's very possible that maybe forcing you to price equal to marginal cost will result in you taking losses. And if that's the case, then the question is, what do we do? Now, one option is we could offset these losses with a subsidy. So have the government step in, hand you the money to cover your losses just to keep you in business so you don't shut down. But in that case, we have the problem of the government having to raise the money. Now, in itself, this is not necessarily a problem. Government does, in fact, tax things and does raise money that way. But politically, this is a very difficult sell. To say, well, we want to subsidize this monopoly, and to do that, we're going to tax various people. Generally, people don't like monopolies. They don't like the idea that we're going to just be handing money to a monopoly, and they certainly don't like the idea of being taxed so that money can be handed to a monopoly. So, politically, we run into rather serious problems here, even though technically this could get us to the social optimum.